Hello, and welcome back to our series on Be Anxious for Nothing. I hope these lessons have been a blessing to you, and today we're going to dive into one of our specific categories, marriage and anxiety. When Paul writes in Philippians 4, be anxious for nothing, it includes everything. There's not a single thing in this life that should bring us anxiety. But if I asked you, has your marriage ever brought you stress or anxiety? I'm sure you would say no. And if everyone could have the same kind of marriage we have, no one would ever have any problems. Of course, we're kidding ourselves if we thought that going from living solo to living with anyone else full-time would not bring some level of stress and anxiety to our daily lives. There are so many complexities and components of a marriage that we don't have time to discuss all of them over the course of our study today. But we're going to mention a few of them, and I hope that you'll take this lesson with you, share it with your spouse, your kids, or anyone else you know that would benefit from a lesson on stress and marriage. One of the most common texts that we hear in weddings is in Ephesians chapter 5. And starting in verse 25, Paul lays out for us some very simple commands for our marriages. And if we would all just obey his words and certainly the teachings of Jesus, where it says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. And women or wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord. This would be a very short lesson if we would just follow those commands. But unfortunately, it's not always that simple, and we need some other guidelines for us that help us achieve those particular goals. While I've only been married for 18 years, 19 years this year in August, I don't consider myself an expert on anything, and certainly not in marriage. But I do believe that when we put three things together, it breeds a recipe for successful marriage in which we can reduce our stress and eliminate anxiety with the people that we love the most in this life. When common sense and preparation and communication come together, we find that living with someone else can be a lot easier. So what is common sense? A dictionary might define common sense as sound and prudent judgment on a simple perception of the situation or facts. And while that sounds simple, it isn't an exact science because sound and prudent judgment may differ in a world of subjectivity. What is common to one person may not be common to everybody else. For example, if you grew up in a Christian home where your parents had a mutual love and respect for each other and did things a certain way, and you marry someone who grew up in maybe a broken home or in foster care or was adopted or lived in a different culture with a different language, when those two things come together, those two relationships come together, what is common for one isn't always going to be common for the other. But we also have to deal with the law of averages when it comes to difficult things like abuse and neglect. Because when you look at percentages of every single person, more times than not, people grow up in homes that experience some level of neglect or abuse. And when that person meets somebody and develops a relationship with someone who didn't grow up that way, what is common becomes very different for both of these two people. And so we have to consider what these relationships are going to look like whenever these come together. Because there are times when opposites attract, and two people that come from very different backgrounds can come together harmoniously and get along very well. But there's also times when opposites do not attract. And in those circumstances, people may have to work a little harder if the relationship will work out. When it comes to what should be common, the Bible must always be our go-to resource for making an agreement or coming to an accord on any given circumstance or situation. Jesus is very clear in Matthew 19 on what he expects from two people that commit their lives together. And when people do not follow those guidelines, there are certainly consequences and results that Jesus outlines as well. And those are instructions that we need to pay attention to. On a very personal note, the advice I've heard is in a dating relationship, if two people are not ready to get married, then they really don't have any business or need to be in that dating relationship. And you can do with that advice what you like. The second key for living together or coming together in marriage is preparation. This step is not only important before we get married, but also just as important as we continue to develop our relationship with our new spouse. Every single day, we should be waking up thinking of, how can I be better in my marriage today than I was yesterday? And if we want to grow in our marriage, we must constantly be changing. And certainly we mean changing for the better. One of the fundamental principles behind growth is change, and that's true in every area of our life. The goal for our marriage is to be better every day, and this may require some creativity. It may require us to think outside the box, but every good marriage requires hard work, and the blessing is worth the work that we put into it. When we talk about being prepared for marriage, there's always a giant elephant in the room. And so we're going to make a seat for him right here and get real comfortable for just a moment with the idea of sex. Sex is one of those topics that most of us don't like to talk about. It's a word that can make us feel uncomfortable a lot of times. There may be times when we're with friends or other people where we feel more comfortable talking about it. But when it comes to the idea of an intimate relationship with someone else, there are some things that we certainly need to discuss. And while I want to address this topic specifically for people that are not yet married, there are a lot of things that will be applied both before we get married and after we get married. Because there's a lot more to becoming one flesh in a marriage context than just the sexual component of the relationship. While I've never been bold enough to ask a group of people in a classroom setting if they have intimacy issues and ask for a show of hands, I'm sure that if I did, most of us would be raising our hands. It's a very common thing for people to deal with, but it's also a very common thing for people to overcome. If you have intimacy marriage issues, my suggestion is very simple. Make intimacy a priority in your marriage. Communicate with each other, even if it's awkward. Take that step through awkward and make intimacy a priority so it can be what God wants it to be in your marriage. Gary Chapman authored The 5 Love Languages, and it's a great book for couples to read through together to find out how it is that they want to receive love from their spouse. Before we got married, Kristen, my wife, read through this book and she highlighted in pink everything that was important to her. I then read through it and I highlighted everything that was important to me in blue. And we found out there were a number of areas where we crossed over, and that became the color purple. It's a really good practice to help us better understand what our spouse not only needs from us, but what they want from us within a loving relationship. It's also very important to have proper expectations going into a marriage, and then certainly while we're married, when it comes to what we expect from our potential spouse. For example, when it comes to intimacy, what do we expect from our future spouse? When I was in college, I knew guys who were adamant that their future spouse must be a virgin, and that was a deal breaker for them. And so I asked them the question, well, are you yourself a virgin? And they said no. And I thought, well, that doesn't make any sense. How can you expect from somebody you're going to marry something you haven't expected from yourself? And when it comes to topics like that, it's really important, maybe not on the first date, but if it's a deal breaker for you, it's something that needs to be addressed long before you walk down the aisle with your potential spouse. But before you determine all of your deal breakers within a marriage, it's also important to read Matthew 18. I think it's interesting, before Jesus addresses marriage, divorce, and remarriage in Matthew 19, he addresses a very important topic of forgiveness before we get to that section on marriage, something we all need to consider. The dating relationship is a precursor for marriage. And personally, if the goal for the relationship is not marriage, I think I would put the dating relationship on hold. The responsibility of helping prepare those who are not married for marriage falls on those who are married. And we have a responsibility to guide them in all of the areas we're going to look at in the weeks ahead as it relates to finances and our jobs and parenting and all the other components like faith and prayer that are so important within a marriage context. The third key for successful marriages is communication. Before I got married, my dad sat down with me and he said, "Son, there's 3 keys to a successful marriage." And so if you have notes and you're writing down, I would encourage you to write these down. The first was communication. The second was communication. And the third, if you're guessing, was communication. Communication is the number one key when it comes to not just a successful marriage, but a successful relationship. 100% of our problems at some level can break down to either no or poor communication. And certainly the way we resolve those problems is also communication. If you have effective communication in a relationship, there needs to be a level of transparency and honesty. And at the same time, the delivery of this communication must be encompassed with love. There may be awkward moments, there may be situations that we don't want to deal with. But if we want to have success in our marriage and avoid stress and anxiety, we need to address those situations with love and with honesty and transparency. Another key component in that communication is grace. When somebody is willing to be vulnerable and communicate with us something that is difficult or awkward, we need to receive that communication with grace. But we also need to deliver that information with grace as well, especially when it comes to accepting responsibility for something we did in our past, or maybe something we've done in the recent past that's going to have consequences that are in the future. If you are not married, one of the greatest qualities that you can find in a potential spouse is an effective communicator. If you must constantly guess what someone else is thinking, you will find a life full of anxiety and fear and perhaps irritation. If you are married, I hope you and your spouse both communicate well with each other. And if this is not the case, I would encourage you to sit down and take some time to really get to know each other on a more intimate level with your communication. Also, when it comes to communication, there are some very key components that we must deal with as we communicate with people, and these can be a very positive thing. One, we need to communicate the obvious. My wife knows I believe she is the most beautiful woman in the world because I've told her that. But just because I told her that once doesn't mean I don't need to continue reassuring her and telling her that all the time. Communicating the obvious can be an effective tool in just keeping people with a smile on their face, with the positivity and love we communicate on a regular basis. There was a movie that came out years ago, and the older couple in the movie were having problems. And the woman comes to the husband, she says, "I just don't think you love me anymore." And he responds with, "Woman, when we got married 25 years ago, I told you that I loved you, and if that ever changed, I would let you know." That's not a great way to communicate our love to someone else. We need to hear those things over and over and over. Great communication doesn't happen by accident. It requires us to be intentional with those that are closest to us. We must learn our spouse's love language and learn to communicate it effectively as though our marriage depends upon it. One of the other things we need to address are goals and expectations in our marriage. And these are two different things, but also very short and simple. One, our goal needs to be perfection. And while that sounds daunting, can you imagine if you set a goal for your marriage? I'm going to be 50% of the husband I need to be. That's a good goal. That doesn't sound right. It doesn't make any sense. Our goal needs to be 100%. I'm going to be perfect. But our expectation needs to be, I'm going to mess up sometimes. And that needs to be on both sides so that we have a goal, but also an expectation of ourselves and of our spouse that we are going to mess up and that we will respond with grace and love in those times. If we will put this into practice, we will find that it's easier to forgive when our spouse misses the mark. Remember, if we want to be perfect, we have to make our best effort. Let us all remember to give each other grace and love in those times where we fall short. A positive and forgiving attitude will help us decrease stress and create a healthy environment in our home. Think for a moment about the piece of advice you would give to someone or others to improve their marriage. What is the greatest lesson that you've learned in your own marriage, and how can you share that with other people? If I could offer you just one piece of advice, it would be this: don't compare your marriage to someone else. Your marriage is where it is because of where you've come from. Other people's marriages are where they are at a different point in their journey than where you are. Comparison will always rob you of the joy that God intends for you to have in your marriage. So work on you and your marriage, and don't compare yourselves to others. Be the very best version of yourself that you can be. I mentioned last week that there's going to be a map at the end of every lesson. And so your map for today, your motivation, your advice, and your prayer are this. Your motivation: to the married, take time to have an open conversation with your spouse this week. Be transparent, laugh, express love. Ask for one thing you can do to show your spouse you love them and appreciate them. Next week, repeat. The week after that, repeat again and again and again. The advice: be a good listener. Don't aim for average or normal. Love God first and then your spouse. If you do this correctly, your spouse will be blessed because of it, and so will you. And the prayer for this week: God, thank you for life. Thank you for free will and freedom. Help me be a good communicator. Help me be a good listener. Help me to help and teach those younger than me the importance of preparation and communication before they marry, that they may have a prosperous perspective of how you designed the marriage relationship. May you be glorified in all my relationships. In the name of Jesus, amen. For the rest of our time, I'd like for you to consider the questions that are going to appear on the screen right now. These may be questions for you to reflect on by yourself or share within a small group setting. Transparency. Did you have an example of a transparent marriage from your parents? How did this affect you before and after you were married? Do you need to be more transparent in your marriage? How will you make this happen? Responsibility. What choices did you make prior to marriage that have consequences you are responsible for now? How can you learn from those choices? How can they be a blessing to someone else? Are you living in the present moment? What choices are you making today to be more responsible? Intentionality. What is the difference between intentional and intentions? What are the intentions of your heart within your marriage? And be specific. What are you doing proactively or intentionally to achieve these intentions? Appreciation. What is your spouse's love language? Are you speaking your spouse's love language even when it's difficult? Why or why not? Limits. What are you willing to do for love? And what are you not willing to do for love? And simplify. What does a simple marriage look like? Are there aspects of your marriage you can change or get rid of that would be beneficial to your stress levels? And what are they? Next week, we're going to address one of the most difficult topics for me, and that is parenting. And I hope you'll make plans to join us then. Until then, may the Lord bless you and keep you.